There we go. Okay, we will officially get started then. Um, so thanks. For those who are eating their lunch right now, thanks for joining me during your lunch break. But today we are going to cover all things notices. This is the Polaris Notice Bootcamp. So in this session, we will be taking an in-depth look at Polaris notices and some of the problems we tend to encounter with them. Some of this information may be purely review for you, some may be brand new. And like, as always with our virtual trainings, the session is being recorded. It will be posted online and it will be shared to everyone who registered, shared in CCS News. So you'll have access to it if you need to rewatch it, review anything, share with a colleague, etc. Here is our agenda for today. So in the first half of this session, we're going to look at the different types of notices libraries send and the available delivery methods. And then the second half will focus on troubleshooting and notice-focused reports that you have access to. Now, just one thing I want to quickly mention today, what we won't be going over today is how to generate print notices. So there's documentation on our website along with a handful of videos or recordings of previous training sessions to guide you through how to generate print notices. So today we're really going to be taking a step back from looking at how to do things in Leap and instead look at the overall setup of how things work. And what we're going to start with is talking about what types of notices libraries send to patrons. So we've got 4 types of notices that all libraries send out and 6 types that are optional. And we will start with the notice types sent by all libraries. Some of these notice types and details will be very familiar to you. Other stuff might be new. So we're going to start with our overdue notices. Overdue notices are obviously sent when an item is overdue a certain number of days. We will send up to 3 overdue notices for an item, and all libraries share the same schedule. So our overdue notices are sent when an item is 3 days overdue, 15 days overdue, and the final one at 28 days overdue. Now, one important thing to remember about overdue notices is that they are dependent on a particular sequence. So for example, Polaris will not trigger a second overdue notice if that first overdue notice was never generated. And that means that a patron will never receive that third overdue notice if the second overdue notice wasn't generated. So this reliance on sequence is going to pop up throughout the day. And then here's just some other facts about the overdue notice along with a screenshot. So overdue notices, they're generated once a day in the morning. They're sent by the transacting or the checkout library, and they're offered in all formats. So print, phone or telephony, email, and text message. Now, once all 3 overdue notices have been issued and that item reaches 45 days overdue, a bill notice is sent, then the item flips to lost status and the fee is applied to the patron's record. So again, this is where that sequence is important. A bill won't be generated unless 3 overdue notices have been generated and posted for that item. And notice how on the slide it says that bill notices are generated and then the item flips to loss and the charge is applied. So an item will never transition to lost unless it can tell a bill notice was generated. So again, that sequence is the bill notice is generated, then the item flips to lost and the charge is applied. Just like overdues, bill notices are generated once a day in the morning and sent by the transacting library. In terms of how these bill notices are delivered, they are available as emails, text messages, or print notices. So bills will not be sent via phone notice. For those phone notice patrons, they will instead generate a printed bill. The next notice type that all libraries send are hold notices. So these are generated when an item is trapped and then becomes ready for pickup. And no surprise here, they're sent by the pickup library. Hold notices are available in all formats. Um, and unlike other notice types, holds are sent multiple times a day, at least for email and text, and continuously as they queue up for a phone. So for phone notices, those will go out between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. daily. So when an item traps for a phone notice, that notice is added to the phone queue and it will be sent when it reaches the top of the queue. So, like early on in the day, when we're also sending those overdue notices and hold notices from the previous evening, the queue may be somewhat long and it could take a little bit of time for the patrons to get their notice. However, as you get later into the day and telephony is caught up with calls, there's going to be like little to no queue for phone notices. So later on in the afternoon, when a hold traps, it will likely generate and send that phone notice pretty quickly. And then finally, in terms of like print hold notices, those are generated when an item is trapped and then the library runs and posts their print hold notices. So one thing you should know about this hold notice is that it's only going to be sent if the item status is still ready for pickup. So if the patron ends up checking the item out before the notice is generated and posted, Polaris will just delete the notice. So like say it's 11 o'clock, you trapped a hold for an email notice patron. If the patron comes before the notice job next runs at noon and checks out the item, they won't get their notice, their hold notice. And then the last notice type that all libraries send is the reminder notice, also known as the auto-renewal notice. So this notice alerts patrons they have items coming due and or items that have been auto-renewed. So 3 days before an item is due, Polaris will send the patron a notice in the morning that lists the items that were auto-renewed with their new due date or items that couldn't be renewed, reminding them that, hey, they're due soon. This notice type is a little different in that it's only available as an email notice. Also, these reminder notices work a little differently in that it's sent to any patron with an email address in the record, regardless of notice type preference. So if my notice type preference is phone, but I have an email listed in my record, I'll still get a reminder notice. And then for those who don't have email addresses, don't worry about them. Their items will still auto renew. They just won't receive a notification of the new dates. So this brings us to those optional notice. These are notice types that are available, but the library doesn't have to use them. They will only be activated if the library wants to use it. So there are 6 to go through. So we've got a lot of potential notices that you could send. One is the second hold notice. So this is just basically a reminder pickup notice. If the patron hasn't picked up their hold after 3 days, the pickup library will send a reminder notice the following morning. Second hold notices are sent by patron preference, and it's basically a duplicate of the original hold notice, right? There's no change in language in their email or their text. It's the exact same notice. Now, if your library has a longer hold period, this may be a notice that you would consider. If you only have holds available for pickup for like 4 days or 5 days, this may not be a helpful notice for you. And then kind of related is a canceled hold notice. This notice will alert the patron when a still pending hold, so it has to have a status of requested or pause. When a still pending hold has been canceled by staff in LEAP, or in the client, or if the patron canceled their own hold in the pack. So, if an on-order title is not going to be published and staff cancel the purchase order, the patron will receive a cancellation notice. However, if staff are just doing cleanup where they need to cancel and replace a hold, the patron will still get a cancel hold notice. Further, the cancel hold notice is not issued for holds that become unclaimed, right? So there are definitely both benefits and drawbacks to this particular notice type. I will say we did have this notice type on briefly for all libraries when we first went live on Polaris. Definitely caused some issues, so we turned it off within a week. However, it's still there, it's available. If you are interested in this notice or any other of these optional notices we talk about, reach out to CCS and we can get you some more details on this notice type and activate it if you are interested. So the next optional notice is a fine notice. This notice is sent to patrons who owe over a certain amount in fines. Libraries can use this as a pre-collections notice. So basically how this works, when a patron owes over a certain amount in fees and those fees remain unpaid for a certain amount of time, the library will send a fine notice. So for example, patrons who owe over $25 in fees and those fees reach 30 days old without being paid, the patron will get a notice. And then the library can set their own fee threshold and fee age too. However, unlike submitting to collections, any fee is going to count towards this notice. So if a patron owes $27 in Maker Studio fees, those fees don't count towards collection submission, but the patron will still receive a fine notice. Now, this notice is sent by the patron's registered library, and it's only sent to users registered to your library. And for this notice, it is offered in email, text, and print. It's not offered as a phone notice. So those patrons will receive, won't receive a fine notice. However, one way around this, some libraries who have this active will send the notice just as print. So all other delivery options are deactivated. It's only available as print. And this means that a print notice will be generated for all patrons, regardless of their notice preference type. So with this method, you can make sure that you include those phone notice patrons. Another benefit to only activating it in print is, it's just something a little more formal or tangible to send the patron besides a text notice before they go to collections.
I just have a comment on this fine notice one that we just saw that one. I had an issue over last year about a gentleman who didn't want to pay the collection fee because it didn't say he was going to collections. Why should he pay it? We went round and round with him, and that's when we started to send out this notice that says you may be sent to collections, so we could bypass all those people who are in, but it didn't say you were sending me to collections. And either way, just so you know, he did pay it. He finally paid it. He tried to get another card somewhere else, but he finally got it. But anyway, I think this works out really beautifully.
I'm glad they work for you, Maggie.
I have a question about this notice.
Yeah.
So would this be for build material also?
Yes. So it would be any fee type.
So they would get a billing notice at 45 days, right?
Yes.
And then I'm sorry if I missed it. What day would this be sent? This fine one?
This is actually up to the library. So
Okay.
yeah, so basically you can set at whatever point, a fine, you consider a fee to become quote unquote stale. So anything that's unpaid after 25 days or 30 days is going to count towards the minimum threshold for this notice.
So we could have it set between that 45 days and when they would be sent to collections.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. The most common optional notice type is the pre-expiration reminder notice. So this notice is sent to patrons 31 days before their library card expires, just as a reminder to come in and renew it. Just like those item due date reminder notices, the expiration reminder notice is only sent as an email. And it's also sent to any patron who has an email address on file, regardless of their preference. Now, one thing this is kind of a more recent one. We had this one kind of dormant for a while, and we just activated it for our first library. If your library does not use expiration dates, another optional notice that you may be interested in is an inactive patron notice. So this one is issued to patrons who have not used their card in X number of days, and that's based on the patron last activity date. And then, of course, your library can set that threshold. So if you want to say, send to someone who hasn't used their card in 6 months or 1 year. And it's just kind of like saying, hey, don't forget you have a library card. The library is pretty awesome. Come use it. And then just like those other reminder notices, the inactive patron notice is sent by email to anyone who has an email address on file. Oh yeah, Belinda, you can also link to like a page for digital resources too, if that's what you're commenting on.
Mieko, that was going to be my question. Is this notice, like everything above, thank you for using the library, totally customizable?
Yes, the inactive patron notice is customizable.
Cool, thank you.
My question really quick, Mieko, was about what if they just use it for digital? Does that count as usage or no?
That will. So one of the things that patrons,
Okay, so then
Yeah.
they're using it though, but
They're
that's
using
still,
it. Yeah.
okay,
As long as they're using a service that will update that last activity dates, like if they check out an ebook through like Overdrive,
sure.
it will, that counts as usage.
Okay,
so they
okay,
might
thank
be
you.
excluded. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then the last optional notice is a patron billing statement. And this one is a little different than all the others because it can only be manually generated by a library in print. So, we don't have a way to set it up to run automatically like a card expiration notice reminder. But what it does, a patron billing notice lists all the current charges on a specific patron's accounts, like anything that's unpaid, regardless of the fee reason. So overdues, lost, manual charges that you've added. But the nice thing about this notice is that you have the ability to generate it for just a single patron if you want to, just as long as you have their barcode. And since you can send it to a single patron, you can target someone special that you're working with, or maybe who just kind of needs a nudge to get things back in. And maybe they don't line up for a traditional like lost item bill notice or a fee notice. This way you can manually generate something to send off to them. And then in terms, we had a text earlier about the custom notice or custom text. Most of the notices that we have do use system-wide standardized text. A few notices have variations based on if you're like a fine library versus a fine-free library, or if you submit to patrons to collections. And this is just so that patrons will have some context of consequences, right? If they're being blocked versus accumulating late fees. And then in terms of custom text, libraries currently have the option of using custom text for hold notices, for those card pre-expiration notices or inactive patron notices. This is just so mainly that you can specify individual service needs, like if you offer curbside pickup. And then finally, all email notices will have the individual library information on the footer. Yeah, Anastasia.
I'm so sorry for that fine notice again. Does it have, can you put a message saying something about being sent to collections? I didn't get it.
We have 2 variations for the fine notice. One variation is for libraries who submit patrons to collections. So it will have a comment in there that like your account may be submitted.
Okay, thank you. And then I know I should probably know this, but what's the number of days again past billing when someone be sent to collections?
That varies based on library. Yeah, if you hang out after, I'll pull up settings, we can check.
Thanks.
So now that we know what types of notices patrons can receive, I want to talk more about how they receive them. So patrons can choose from 4 different types of delivery methods. We've got print, phone or telephony, email or text message. So let's start with our phone messages. Phone notices are sent during specific hours. So I've said before, they're delivered between 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. daily. We do have multiple phone numbers that these calls come from. When the call comes in, the caller ID may say public library for landlines, or if your cell phone displays caller ID. For many cell phones, however, the user will just likely see the phone number, one of these phone numbers here. If the call is unable to get through after 3 tries, right? So telephony detects a hang up 3 times in a row or gets a busy signal 3 times in a row, Polaris will automatically shift that notice to print. And when telephony delivers a message, it also records what happens with the call. So you've likely seen reports or a notice history where it says things like call completed, voice, or hang up detected. And here's how it determines what happens during the call. Since there aren't any standards between what all the different types of services and phones do, right? So no standard length of voicemail intro, no standard voicemail beep to signal it's time to leave a message. Telephony uses periods of silence, frequency changes, and voltage changes to determine what happens. If a human picked up, if it got the answering machine, if the line is busy, if a call hung up on them prematurely. So it's like these 3 elements that help telephony determine what happens. And this will come up again later on in our troubleshooting. One question that comes up every so often is if a patron will get multiple calls.
To your...
Oh, I'm sorry, is there a question? Just gonna pause for a second. Okay, if there is a question, do feel free to just pop it in chat or interrupt me and ask. So in terms of getting multiple phone calls a day, the answer is no. So telephony for phone notices, a patron will only receive 1 phone call a day. If a patron has multiple phone notices in the queue, those notices will be batched into a single message. So for example, if I have an overdue item and a hold trap for me before the phone notices start, I'll receive a single phone call letting me know that, hey, I've got an overdue item and a hold to pick up. However, if a second hold traps for me later that afternoon, telephony will wait to call me until the next day, right? So it limits patrons to 1 phone call a day. Next are email notices, which are the most common notice type. Most email notices are issued in the morning. They're generated and sent branch by branch, so timing can vary slightly based on branch order. They will start around 8:30 a.m. And then, like we said before, hold email notices are also sent at noon and 4 p.m. daily. And just like telephony, if an email notice errors out after 3 tries, Polaris will default that notice to print. So the default address that email notices are sent from is no-reply@ccslib.org.
Sorry, Miko, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So if we trap a hold at 5 p.m., the email notice wouldn't go out till 12 p.m. the next day, correct?
It'll go out in during the morning run around 8:30.
So there's, for the hold notices, it's 8:30, noon, and 4?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Some libraries have set up to where they use a local address in the from. So like, for example, Niles sends theirs from notice@nileslibrary.org. If this is the case, email and text notices posted by the library will display that local address. One other thing for those who use a local address, patrons can also reply to that address. So definitely watch that inbox to catch any replies. Next format patrons have access to is a text message, and these tie in closely with email for several reasons. First, they're issued at the same time as emails. So all notice types run in the morning, and then hold notices run again at noon and 4. But they also tie in closely with emails because text notices start out as emails. They run through a process that translates the email into a text message using what's called a gateway. And this is why we need to know what carrier or network the user is on in order to make that translation, right? So email notices or text messages start out at emails and then are translated into texts during delivery. So similarly, by default, texts appear to come from no-reply@ccslit.org. And again, if your library set up their own notice address, their local address, it will appear to come from that local address. And then again, just like an email, if a text message errors out after 3 tries, it's going to default to print. So patrons can choose to receive only text messages or receive an email notice plus a text notice together. Essentially, you're stacking your notices. So if I have my patron registration set up like in the screenshot here, where I have my notification option as email, plus this additional text notice checkbox selected, I will get an email and a text at the same time for most notice types. And then finally, with print notices, with this delivery method, it's up to the library to generate the notice and mail it to the patron. Like I said earlier, we've got step-by-step instructions and videos online that will show you how to print those notices. The library should run print notice jobs regularly, like ideally in a perfect world, Monday through Friday. But things happen. If everyone who runs notices is out on Thursday and can't run the job that day, like that's totally okay. Just run it the next time you're able. Oh, we've got a question here. If the email setting defaults to print, is that change in the patron's record or only for, oh, that's such a great question, Georgia. Okay, so if an email like errors out and it generates that print notice, it will only generate a print notice for that single notice. Like the next time the patron is due for like a hold notice or an overdue notice, it will go back to their email. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a really good question. Let's see. And then the one other thing I want to mention about print notices is that it's very important to run those print notice jobs and post them to the database. If you don't post those overdue and bill notices, like again, it's that sequence thing. None of those items will progress to lost. So another question that can come up is what happens if the patron doesn't have a notice preference? So if you see a patron in their registration field and the notification option is just none here, what does that mean? So if a patron does not have a notice preference set, notices will not be generated. And as we said before, like this is the issue when it comes to overdue and bill notices. So if a patron does not receive notices, their items will never become billed. Later on in the report segment, I'll highlight a report that will help you identify these users who may have this in their registration. And kind of along those same lines, like just one little registration reminder here, you also do not avoid excluding patrons from overdue and billing notice because again, that's going to stop that notice type from being generated at all, which will again prevent that item from ever flipping to lost. Okay. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions before we move on to the troubleshooting portion of the training. Okay. So in the second half of the session, we're going to focus on notice issues and troubleshooting notices. I want to start out by clarifying what is considered a failure? Because we've mentioned failure several times already in the first half of the session. And I just want to make sure I can clarify what exactly constitutes as a failure. So for telephony, excuse me, I'm just going to mute myself for a second there. Okay. For telephony, a call is considered a failure if a human answer or an answering machine cannot be logged. So if telephony registers a busy signal, if it registers a hang up, or it cannot detect an answer or a voicemail. So again, it's the system is going to count periods of silence. It's going to count those frequency changes, and that's how it detects, hey, here's a frequency of a human voice versus a busy signal. Or it's going to use those voltage changes, and that's how it detects a hang up to determine if and how a call was received. So there's a lot going on with telephony. For emails and text, if the email or text can't be successfully issued from our server, that's considered a failure. Reasons for this can be an improperly formatted email address. So I've got some examples up on the screen here with just like punctuation missing or like improper character in there. Or another reason, just if the email or text fails to go out due to a server error. A question about telephony failures. Does the answering machine also refer to voicemails? Yes, I know it's kind of an outdated term. But anytime it's the answering machine, it's either like a physical answering machine or it's a voicemail. Now, as we've mentioned before, Polaris will attempt to send those phone, email, and text notices 3 times. And if all 3 attempts fail, most notices are going to default to print. And then like we mentioned before, it's going to go back to the patron's preferred format the next time a notice is generated for that patron. And one thing to note here, it doesn't, it excludes like those reminder type notices. So the auto-renewal notices, like hey, the pre-expiration notices, those are like courtesy notices. They're kind of like a one and done notice. So if they fail, they're not going to attempt again or default to print. Now, here's where we get into the troubleshooting part. Like, what isn't considered a failure? So if a call is picked up by a person or a voicemail, but that message gets cut off too early, that's not considered a failure. Or if the email or text is issued from our servers successfully, but it doesn't reach the patron, like if the message is filtered out by a spam message or junk message, that's also not considered a failure. So for these situations where it's not a failure, just here are some things that we or the patron can do to troubleshoot, or in some cases, what limitations that we can run into when troubleshooting. So let's start with some phone calls. The patron is set up for phone notices, but they say they're not getting calls. There's a couple things we can do. Some of these are going to be really obvious, but I feel like I need to say them anyways. Just check with the patron that the phone number is correct, that there's no, inverted digits or anything. Also, have the patron check to see if their voicemail is full. This seems like a really simple and obvious step, but if they're anything like me, like it can be easy to forget to delete voicemails. Excuse me. Alternately, check to see when notices were issued. So like we had mentioned earlier, patron will only receive 1 phone notice a day. So if they've received like a queued up hold notice in the morning and then a second one trapped in the afternoon, the patron's not going to receive the call for that second hold until the following day. And here's just some tips if you need to check to see if a notice was generated for them. Oh, I'm just going to check chat real quick. What if the email that was given has a block? Oh, would not go through their firewall. We'll hold that question when we get to our email troubleshooting. There might be some tips in there that can help for that. So if you need to check patrons, if a notice was generated for a patron, where can you see that information? So when you're in the patron's record, there is a tab for notices. And based on your screen size, this will likely be nestled under the More drop-down menu. So this tab will display the past 6 months worth of notices for that patron. And in here, you can click on any of these titles. And what that's going to do is it's going to open up and give a list of all related notices that were generated for that item. So in a screenshot here, I can see when the patron was sent the reminder notice, when they were sent all 3 overdue notices and the bill notice. So if you've already need to see if they've checked to see if they've received a phone call for today, check out their notice history. Now, if a patron complains that their voicemail was cut off, this one's going to be tricky, guys. The biggest culprit for this complaint tends to be their own greeting message. So if the patron has a long greeting for their voicemail, it may cause the voicemail to get cut off. Or if the patron has big pauses in their greeting. So if their greeting says something like, "Hi, you have reached so-and-so," pause, "Please leave a message," pause. That can affect the voicemail. Again, since there's no standard system for beeps in voicemail systems, telephony instead relies on periods of silence to determine when it's okay to start the message. So in greetings with a long pause, the telephony message may begin after that first pause. So when the voicemail actually starts recording, they're going to get the beginning of that message cut off. And then another possibility is just if the voicemail record time is short, the end of the message is going to be cut off. So the settings that we currently have in place are the recommended settings. These are determined using Innovative's recommendations from testing major service providers to find timings that would work for the majority of phone systems. But of course, as with everything, there's going to be outlier situations. So short of having the patron like modify their voicemail, this is going to be one of the situations where there's really not much staff can do. So hopefully the patron can hear enough of the message to understand what it's notifying them about and who the message is coming from. Otherwise, they may want to explore switching to like an email message.
Mieko, can I
Yes.
ask?
Yeah.
So this is interesting that this came up. A patron just in the past week has been complaining that they haven't received any phone calls about holds that are waiting for them.
Okay.
And we verified the phone number, blah, blah, blah. We did all that stuff. And it still wasn't working. So I put in a ticket. Kathleen said that I have to add the carrier, even though it's a phone call and not a text. And I'm just curious, like, what, do you know anything about why something like that would be?
I wonder if there's a miscommunication there, because you do not need the carrier if it's just for.
Right. And I
Yeah.
said to her, but I thought that's just for
Cool.
text. This is her phone call. She
Yeah.
goes, well, everything else with this. Yeah. Okay. So never mind. I'll
No.
ask her about that.
Yeah, I'll touch base with you too. I'm curious to take a look at this patron's record and just take a look at like the notice history, maybe check some error reports. So
Yeah. Okay.
I will probably tap into you after the training to get the patron info if you don't mind.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Now, text messages. If the patron is set up for text notices, but they're not getting texts, again, check that number. I know this is probably the first thing everyone does. It's probably very redundant for me to put it on here, but I'm doing my due diligence and putting it on here. The second thing, check that the carrier is entered correctly so their messages are being sent through that correct network. Now, in terms of carriers, if they're unsure of their network, for example, I don't know how many of you have encountered consumer cellular, and consumer cellular is a little different in that it piggybacks off of networks from other carriers, right? It doesn't have its own dedicated network. It uses like AT&T or T-Mobile. So in these situations, you might need to work with the patron to verify what their network is. Now, the easiest way to do this is have the patron email or send a text to like your email or one of the library's emails. So just like our email to text process, their text will basically go through the reverse. So it's going to start off as a text message. It's like here, I'm sending a text to this email message or email address. And then it's going to arrive as an email and it's going to appear to come from their phone number. And so it went through that gateway, which translated it from a text to an email. And then the nice thing is using that email, the from or the message branding, we can see which network they're on. So when I texted my email, I could see from the resulting email address and the branding that I'm on T-Mobile's networks. So that's how, if you're kind of stuck and unsure what network the patron is on, this is the easiest way to determine that. Thanks, Carrie. It took me a while to figure that one out. One more specific thing to check for is if the text issue is limited to like hold notices. Ask yourself, does your library use custom hold notices that includes a link like to a curbside pickup tool? If patrons are not receiving text for a hold notice, it may be due to the link. So what we found is that some types of links, particularly a bit.ly link, can be flagged as spam and blocked more than other link types. It's kind of a nitpicky thing to check for. Another really nitpicky thing to check for, when a user says that they're not getting text messages, look at their registration. Does the user have both text selected as their preference and the additional text message checkbox selected? If so, this setup may be causing an issue. We've seen some examples before where this seems to prevent text messages from coming through for some users. So if the user sticks with text messaging as their notice preference, I would just deselect the additional checkbox and see if that helps. Similarly.
May I go? I'm sorry, I have a quick
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So at our library, if they want email and text notifications, we'll do the notification option as email and then select additional text notice. Would that be?
Perfect. That's yes.
Okay.
That sounds perfect.
Thanks.
Yeah, for some reason, it's just this text plus text that could cause issues. So if the user says that their text messages are getting cut off, this behavior can be due to a combination of carrier plus the type of phone you have, right? So like, for example, if you're like T-Mobile, Samsung S20. For longer text messages, right? Some phones may cut off the message, but then the user can like tap the message to view all. However, other phones may not give that option for business or promotional style messages, and the message just comes through incomplete. So our system-wide shared language text messages are pretty short to avoid this issue. The recommended message length is 160 or fewer characters. So again, like if your library uses some kind of custom messaging for holds, you may get users who like mention this to you. And then one resolution is just to adjust that custom message to be shorter. And then, of course, everyone's favorite troubleshooting topic, email. So if the user says that they didn't get an email, but the email is not on an error report, this really is the hardest to troubleshoot because we're unable to see what that user's email provider does with the email. Email providers are constantly updating their filtering algorithms to keep up with spam, scams, and everything else that the internet can throw at you, which is like completely necessary and helpful. But at times this can also lead to a valid email source being blocked out. So if the email in question is not on the error report, but it's posted to the user's notice history, we know that the notice successfully left our servers. But since we can't tell what happened to it afterwards, we can only speculate on the best way to troubleshoot. And here's some things we can try. First, have the user check their junk or spam folders. In some emails, you can flag a message as not spam to prevent this from happening with future notices. And then I always ask the patron to add the notice email address as a contact to whitelist it. So Chustri, when you mentioned earlier about like a company not letting something go through their firewall, this would be a good way to troubleshoot getting around that. So if they add the notice email to the contacts list, and that could be no reply, or that could be your local address if you set it up like that. Now, if you all of a sudden are getting reports from multiple patrons all at once, bonus points if they have the same provider, this is a sign that there is something going on with the notice server, like a processing job is getting stuck. Or if all of the patrons use that same email provider like Gmail, it could be a sign that the provider made significant changes to their spam algorithms. And the best thing to do here is alert CCS so we can investigate. Now, for those who are using local email addresses, you'll also receive bounce alerts. And if you've ever sent the email, you're likely familiar with those bounce alerts. Those are just like mailer daemon not delivered alerts when your email couldn't reach the recipient. So email and text notices generated from the default address, no reply at ccslib.org, will not get bounce alerts. However, notices generated from a local return address will get bounce alerts. And if this is your library, what can you do with this information? So for many emails, this isn't going to be considered an error. So for these, the notice left our server, it's likely not going to attempt to send again or default to a print notice. We don't have set procedures for what to do with bounces because bounces cover a lot of possibilities. There is a possibility that this is a temporary situation. This is the only notice that's going to bounce for that user, or it could be a reoccurring thing for the patron. So the library can opt to just kind of like leave things as is, or if it feels appropriate, you can check in with the patron to make sure that their contact information on file is correct. Sometimes you'll be able to glean information from the bounce alert. So the bounce alert may say like, hey, address does not exist, which tells you probably need to verify the address of the patron. But other times that message is going to be more generic, like the mailbox is undergoing maintenance, which can be, a whole bunch of things. However, if your library receives bounce alerts and you start to notice an increase in bounce alerts, like what libraries saw in May with Gmail addresses, this can indicate that there's been, a major change of spam algorithms that we need to add or adjust something on the server end. So if your library uses a local address for notices and you notice that your volume of bounce alerts is increasing and there's any patterns you detect, like they bounce from one provider, definitely let us know, alert CCS. So another question we get fairly regularly is if a notice fails or bounces, is there a way to resend it? So again, thankfully, a number of notices if they error out, they're going to default to print after 3 failures. So for these, there's a backup in place. However, if a notice is sent and it's posted to the database, right? So it's successfully left our servers, but it bounced. We unfortunately don't have a way to recreate and send the notice or force it to print. So libraries can deal with those bounces on a case-by-case basis. Please just do best for what works with your library, what works for your library. And then in our last few minutes here, I just very quickly wanted to show you some notice focused reports. So you have access to quite a few reports from a number of sources. Can be overwhelming to try and figure out like what is what. So this is not a comprehensive list. There's definitely some additional reports in the staff client not mentioned here that I'll be honest, like I don't find useful. This segment is going to be more of a highlight, featured reports. And then one report is the summary report. So this report is compiled by Polaris and it's emailed to libraries daily. Now, who it's sent to is up to the library. So CCS, we can modify this distribution list, excuse me, if you need to update who at your library this is sent to. We've also had libraries ask to stop receiving the summary report, which is totally okay as well. So this is a report on email and text notices that your library has sent to patrons. It just covers email and text notices. It does not include phone or print notices. So this report basically gives you an itemized list. You'll have the names and the barcodes of patrons who received the email, like first overdue notices. These guys received the second overdue notices, and so on. Now, the staff client has a handful of failure reports, which includes email, telephony, and text. So users who are part of the reports and notices permission group can access these reports. CCS recommends that libraries check these error reports like once a week or so. It's just good to have your eye on them every so often to make sure that there isn't suddenly a massive increase in failures. This can indicate an issue with the notice processing job or the server itself. You may be asking, what do I need to do with these error reports? I will tell you what you don't need to do. So the library does not need to actively reach out to patrons on this list because, again, if these notice fails after 3 tries, the patron will get their notice in print. If the error is obvious, right, like there's no, @ symbol in the email address that's listed, like feel free to fix that, put a block on the patron account or put, verify with the patron. But you don't need to follow up with every individual patron.
Yeah, I have a quick question about that. Sorry.
Yeah.
How do you know if their phone, like, what if it's because their phone number changed? We need to follow up with a new phone number.
You don't. If their
Okay.
phone number changed, you don't know. So
Okay.
it's one of those things where it's like if you notice someone who's like regularly on this report time and time again, that's probably a good signal to put like a verify info alert on their account. But that, that can be hard to catch if they only have like one hold every so often. One other thing with these reports is that it lists each error instance. So this means that it can potentially, like a notice could error twice, but let's say telephony can get the message through on the 3rd try. So this report is still going to list those first 2 errors, but it's not going to tell you that the notice was sent successfully in the end. And this is just another reason why I want to emphasize staff are not expected to follow up with patrons on this report, right? Either it's going to default to print or the notice is going to get through to the patron. We also have several notice-related reports and web reports, which are compiled by CCS. So one of those is the daily notice delivery report. And this report just gives a daily count of the number of patrons sent notices by your library. And it also gives a count of failures. So it covers all notice types, but it does not list the patrons individually. And one thing here, because texts start out as emails, we're unable to separate email and text counts. So both notice types are counted as emails. The next report, this one's important to know about. This is the Notice Text All Libraries web report. So this report's going to show you what notices say. It runs daily, so it's always up to date. This one is important to check. If your library uses any kind of customized text for those eligible notices, just make sure your text is up to date and it doesn't have outdated like hours of operation or service information. And then finally, we have that web report I alluded to earlier, patrons with no notification option. So earlier we briefly mentioned how patrons should not have a null notification option. This report will show you which users have none as their notification preference. So you can use this report to clean up those records, make sure patrons get notices, and that those overdue items transition to bills. Okay, so that was just a handful of reports available that could be helpful to check on. So quick wrap up. Today, we talked about the different notice types that are sent out. We talked about each delivery method available to patrons, and we reviewed what constitutes as a notice error. Checked out some common troubleshooting tips that will hopefully help you in your future endeavors with patrons. So again, we've got a number of notice resources on our website. Links to pages referenced during training are listed on the slide, and they're also included on your agenda. And then, as always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to CCS. You can always open a help desk ticket, email help@ccslib.org, or definitely feel free to reach out to me directly. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and open it up for if there's any other lingering questions that you may have. One other thing too, I'm gonna pop, where is my chat? I'm gonna pop a link to the evaluation form in the chat. If you have a few minutes to fill it out, it really does help us plan for future sessions. So like I said, as soon as this recording is ready, I will send it out to everyone who registered. I'll post it in this week's CCS news. Thanks for joining, and I'll stick around. I'm going to stop the recording and then I will stick around if anyone has questions.